pollination takes place, the pollen grains are transferred to the stigma, either it may be to the stigma of same flower or stigma of other flower belonging to the same species, but just transfer of pollen grains is not the criteria of pollination. The whatever the pollen grains that are transferred to the stigma should get germinated and leading to the formation of pollen tube. This entire process of transfer of pollen grains and germination of the pollen grain producing the pollen tube and which is initiating the process of fertilization, all that steps is a part of pollen-pistil mechanism or pollen-pistil interactions. So, here what is happening during the process of this pollen-pistil interaction or pollen-pistil mechanism is, so when the pollen grain is transferred to the stigma will identify whether the pollen which is transferred to it is a right type or wrong type. So, what do you mean by this right type of pollen grain and the wrong type of pollen grain? So, right type is called as compatible and whereas wrong type is incompatible we consider. When pollen grains are transferred from anther to the stigma of the same flower or stigma of other flower belonging to same species, so the stigma will consider or it is allowing the pollen grain to germinate on it. So, then it is called as a right type or compatible. In other type where when the pollen grains are transferred from anther to the stigma of different species, what happens is the stigma will not allow the pollen grain to germinate. So, that is what we call it as a wrong type or incompatible. So, here in this process how does the stigma will identify the pollen grain means, here there is an interaction will be there, there is a dialogue between the pistil and the pollen grains. So, this interaction between the stigma and the pollen grains or dialogue between that is between the two structures is initiated by producing some chemicals. So, those chemicals will help in the identification and also germination of the pollen grain to produce a pollen tube. So, this is a way how this dialogue will be there, which will be helping in the identification of right type and the wrong type of pollen grains. So, this is mediated by some chemicals. All this process which is helping in initiating the process and also continuation of the process of pollen tube formation till the initiation of fertilization, all this will be the part of pollen-pistil interaction. So, if pollen-pistil interaction is there only between the similar type of species, so how does the farmer or the plant breeder will get a new variety of plant? So, this can be little bit altered by doing in the artificial manner. If we collect some pollen grains from chickpea, pea or balsam or some other plants, so here what they are needed, what is the chemical which is needed for germination of the pollen grain is a little amount of sugar substance. If we collect the pollen grains of this type of plants and if you put them in 10% of sugar solution for about 15 to 30 minutes, gradually we can observe that the pollen grains of these plants will be start producing some tube-like structure. So, that is called as a pollen tube. And this is a way how we can little bit manipulate the mechanism of pollen-pistil interaction such that the plant breeders can produce the hybrid varieties of plants which will be helping in high yielding varieties and which is helping in production of the food production, we can say production of the crop. So, that is a way how we can little bit manipulate the process by using this type of mechanism. So, this is what we call it as a pollen-pistil interaction.